Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne, and I'm solo today, April 11th, in my interview with Lieutenant Colonel Col Davis, U.S. Army, retired, and we'll be talking about the issue of leaving Syria and a recent article that he wrote about the reasons why leaving Syria would be a good decision. Colonel Davis served 21 years, including 4 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He retired from the Army in 2015, is now a foreign policy and defense analyst and a senior fellow for defense priorities. In 2012, he wrote a classified whistleblower report for Congress about the war in Afghanistan and released an unclassified version of that to the public. Colonel Davis regularly appears on news shows and is published in national and international publications. Welcome, Colonel Davis. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Certainly my pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
There's an article that Colonel Davis wrote recently. I saw it in CNBC, and you'll find links to all of this in the show notes. And it's titled, President Trump is Right, Withdrawing from Syria Strengthens U.S. Security. And of course, this was written before we were on the brink of a hot war with Russia. At the moment, we are waiting for a decision from the president, and it looks very much like he's been taunting Russia this morning. It looks very much like we're going to war, at the very least that we're going to do an attack on Syria. And just to provide some context about where we are, it's kind of hard to provide analysis in this time of uncertainty, but this morning I hate to refer to the tweets, but these are important. He sent out 6 tweets at 6:30 this morning, which were a bit confusing in my view. I'll just read them really quickly. The first one says, the failing New York Times wrote another phony story. It was political pundit Doug Schoen, not a Ukrainian businessman, who asked me to do a short speech by phone, Skype, hosted by Doug in Ukraine. I was very positive about Ukraine, another negative to fake Russia collusion story. The second one, so much fake news about what's going on in the White House. Very calm and calculated, with a big focus on open and fair trade with China, the coming North Korea meeting, and of course the vicious gas attack in Syria. Feels great to have Bolton and Larry K. on board. We are, number 3, doing things that nobody thought possible, despite the never-ending and corrupt Russia investigation, which takes tremendous time and focus. No collusion or obstruction other than I fight back. So now they do the unthinkable and raid a lawyer's office for the information. Bad. Number 4, this is where it gets really scary. Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming, nice and smart. And he puts smart in quotes. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it. Number 5 says, our relationship with Russia is worse now than it ever has been, and that includes the Cold War. There's no reason for this. Russia needs us to help with their economy, something that would be very easy to do, and we need all nations to work together. Stop the arms race. And the last one, much of the bad blood with Russia is caused by the fake and corrupt Russia investigation, headed up by all the Democrat loyalists or people that worked for Obama. Mueller is most conflicted of all, except Rosenstein, who signed FISA and Comey letter. No collusion, so they go crazy. So anyway, he's mixing up all, conflating all kinds of things there of his own personal jeopardy and, the missiles that he is promising to launch at Russia. And he doesn't even, he definitely directs this at Russia. So that's the situation we're in today, though, Colonel Davis's analysis still remains. It's still valid, in my view, extremely wise and informed advice from a man who has spent a lot of time in the Middle East and Afghanistan, on the ground with troops, interviewing hundreds of troops all across Afghanistan, and of course 2 tours in Iraq. So I'll hand this over to you, and we were talking just a little bit before we started recording about, how everyone is very concerned right now, obviously. So I realize this is an awkward position right now, but let's talk about it.
Sure. Yeah. So probably the first is just discuss why it makes sense tactically and strategically to withdraw our forces from Syria, and then maybe we can talk about the current situations and what may or may not be happening with Russia. A couple of reasons why I say that we need to withdraw. Part of that is what is happening on the ground, what has happened, and the risks of things that could happen. So first of all, the point that many make that say, we can't take them out because we'll be repeating the same mistake that when Obama pulled the troops out of Iraq too early and caused the rise of ISIS in 2014. First of all, that is a major myth that I've been doing everything in my power to tamp down every time I see it come up here in the last week or so. It's important to understand, first of all, that the reason why the Iraq surge in 2007, 2008 did succeed at lowering the violence and was substantially effective at lowering American casualties was not because we had some brilliant strategy or, we did great fighting and whatever. It was because the Sunni insurgency, for reasons of their own and of their own initiative, and that's the key part, they decided to join with the United States. They actually reached out to us and said, hey, how about instead of us fighting each other, we work together against our common enemy, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a Sunni organization that should have been a natural ally of the Sunni insurgency, but instead they turned against them for various reasons, which are not important to go into right now. But the Sunni insurgency said, dang, I've got Al-Qaeda against us, we got the Shia against us, and we got the Americans against us. We don't have anybody on our side, and if we don't do something, it's an existential threat. We could actually be Sunni ones. So he got rid of corps commanders, division commanders, even brigade, all the fighting commanders that were Sunni, and replaced them with his own, his personal friends or Shia or others who had paid for positions, etc., which was fine if you don't ever have to fight. But then in, I believe it was June 2014, which is when everything started falling apart, as we've discovered since, ISIS sent what they intended to be a raid into Mosul of 1,000 fighters, which in comparison to the tens of thousands that the Iraq security forces, the police forces that were there, tens of thousands, it was supposed to just be a raid and then leave. But the problem is that because of these poor leaders that were handpicked and put in there, that when the fighting took place, those guys don't know anything about fighting. So they literally ran away. And the division and corps commanders got on a plane and flew out and left those guys behind and went to Baghdad where it was safe. And, of course, then the soldiers just vanished and just melted away. And then, the ISIS fighters suddenly went, dang, we have this. And so then that just fed on, and we all know what happened from that point. The situation in Syria today is radically different from that. Number one, we don't have tens of thousands of troops there. We have 2,000 troops there, which is hardly any. I mean, it's such a minuscule number when you're talking about, in a foreign country. Number two is maybe one of the biggest is that unlike in Iraq, where we had, the support of the host nation military, we're actually antagonistic to the host nation military. They're against us, so they're not on our side. And then the other thing is that there obviously is no kind of agreement on any party to turn against Syria or Russia or anybody else on our side, because they're against us, they're against Syria, or they're against each other. It is a complete chaotic mess. Right. And so us leaving does not create any vacuum, because the Russians have been there since 1971. They've been providing weapons for decades. They've been fighting in this war for several years now. There's no vacuum to create. It's just, it makes no strategic sense for the United States to endure the enormous and saddle ourselves with all this risk that we could be attacked by Russia, by Iranian Quds forces, by the Syrian regime forces, by any number of scores of different Islamic radical groups, all of which, or many of which, consider us an enemy. And then, of course, there's the possibility that we could fight our own NATO ally in Turkey, in Manbij. I mean, everywhere you look, we have extraordinary strategic risk, but there is no kind of upside to this. So we absolutely, not only is it in our interest to leave, we absorb risk every second that they're still there, and we need to shut that off.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you on that. And I mean, I don't know how to put this, but, for civilian Americans, it's a little confusing as to which side we're on over there and why we're on the same side as the people we were against in Iraq.
Here's what happened that got in there, and this is really important to understand as well, especially for somebody who may not be, all that knowledgeable about the tactics and everything else. So Obama started off sending troops over there into Syria, and then President Trump, when he came into office, reinforced that, and the sole purpose was to send troops to help the Syrian Democratic Forces to rid Syria, the capital of Raqqa, the ISIS capital, of ISIS, to get them out of there. So that objective was accomplished. I think it was last October is when that was officially completed. So by rational logic, if you send troops over there to liberate a city, the city is liberated, then this troops should come home. But they didn't. Instead, they just start looking for new jobs. They start looking for new work. Well, you can see where that's going to drift because the whole reason for sending them in there no longer exists. And, of course, now this, as you just mentioned a minute ago, that you're aware that Turkey considers the people that we allied ourselves with to be terrorists on their side. And so they've been attacking and killing them. And we're in this, especially in the city of Manbij right now, we're intertwined with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and we're actually a target potentially. So it just keeps getting more and more messy.
Well, it's now like a protection force in Manbij. So or it sure looks like that anyway.
And it's I've got some, and I'll be honest with you, I have some mixed feelings personally on the matter because I've been to Iraq several times since I've retired as well, and have some really dear friends who are Kurds in that part of the world, and they know some of the people who are on the other side of the border and the Syrian side, and we've gone over there and we've helped them out, and we've kind of allied with them, and now it looks like are we just going to turn our backs to them? But the fact is, as an American, I mean, and I try to tell them this as diplomatically as I can. Look, the United States did not sign up to be a permanent protection force for the SDF. We just can't. And so people don't sign up for the U.S. military to defend Syrian Democratic Forces or any other forces for that matter. And so it's appropriate for us to withdraw, but it's just unfortunate that that is going to leave them a little bit kind of vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I have similar conflicting. I sympathize with the Kurds for sure, and I can see why our troops, feel that way too. But it's almost like we fell into this situation. My understanding is that, creating a resistance force or ground force with the Kurds was not the original intention. The original intention was to create, the train and equip program, an anti-Assad, some of the Sunni rebels, jihadists, a mix.
Right. And of course, that was a disaster from the beginning. And that one I do lay mostly at the feet of President Obama, because that should have been radically clear to anyone who had any experience at all on the ground over there, that was a losing proposition from the beginning, because the culture over in that part of the world is that nobody has permanent alliances. There is shifting allegiances, and I'll work with you today, but I may fight against you tomorrow. And then, 2 weeks later, it may be fighting against somebody else together, because that's just how it operates over there. They have these clans and they have tribes that look out for their interests, and they'll have temporary linkings with other people, as it suits them. So there's no problem for them taking money from us and taking weapons from us, and then 2 days later taking it from an Al-Qaeda backed group, for example. And we had these kind of situations where, it was very painfully in the news a year and a half or so ago, when you had one group that was backed by the CIA fighting another group that was backed by the Pentagon. Two American-backed companies or organizations fighting each other. And so how does that in any way, shape, or form ever get turned into an American interest? It clearly does not. So this has been a losing proposition in every way, and we need to shut this off.
I mean, it's always been two different missions from my point of view. The anti-ISIS mission was one of them, and one that was pretty universally supported, right? That one's easy to support. But the other mission that the CIA was heading up I mean, in my view, that's the one that creates confusion, peril, in my view, contradictory. That's not the side I want to be on.
Yeah, well, without any doubt, you're right. Although I have a bit different view on even on the stuff about Raqqa, because what I've been arguing is that certainly our presence there accelerated the loss of ISIS. But if we had never used one troop and never sent one plane over there to fight, ISIS was a dead man walking from the day that they took power, because they didn't even have the ability. I mean, not even the theoretical possibility of actually holding on to that terrain and becoming a political entity that could endure, because they represented an existential threat to both of the nations where they had land and to nearly all the nations around them. And so they were going to be attacked and destroyed by those, because no one's going to let them just sit there and exist on their territory. And so we could have allowed them to do it, and we could have just sat back and made sure that we protected our interest and continued to do counter-terrorist operations to make sure no one attacked the United States. But we chose to do that, and now then we're kind of paying a price for that, because now we've set up the Syrians to think, or the Syrian Democratic Forces to think that we're going to continue going to stay in there. And I actually got a text from somebody this morning from that part of the world wondering, well, what is the United States going to do? And it's and that's just more of a mess. And that's why we just need to shut this mission down while it's still possible to do it without harming our interests.
Right. And I mean, at this point, the only way to resolve that multifaceted, very difficult, complex problem is through negotiation, it seems to me. And you need Turkey, you need Syria, you need Russia to work that out. And right. I mean, there still is a way for the Kurds have been dealing with Syria, the Syrian government, and Russia. They're in a powerful situation right now to create a situation for themselves.
And what has to happen is, and this is kind of true, really kind of across the board, should be true in the Middle East, and this ought to be something closer to American policy. The people who have to live with the outcome have to be the ones that decide and craft whatever the results are going to be. You know, whatever kind of resolution that this or any other situation, the people who have to live with the outcome are the ones that have to figure it out and negotiate it. But we try so often to impose an outcome and to tell both sides how they need to work, and it just never works. And you're right, because the Kurds that are in Syria, that are part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, I mean, they've lived there forever. They're used to dealing with the Syrian government. That was one of the questions I asked when I was there last year, of some of the people that were in Iraqi Kurdistan at the time. And they said, we have some conversations already with the government of Assad. And, and it's not like this. And it's not like, there were some of the rebel forces that are actively fighting against Assad. They're fighting kind of for themselves, but they're not fighting actively against. So they have some room to negotiate with Assad. So it's not like they're going to be destroyed if we don't. They actually have more fear of Turkey than they do of the Assad regime. So all we have to do is allow the people over there to figure this out on their own. And even if it's going to be a long time, even if it's messy, and it will be, we have to let them do that, because we cannot impose successfully from the outside.
So where is that driving force coming from, that need, that desire to impose our will on it? Because from my informed, but not nearly as informed as you, from my view, it looks like outside forces are driving that need to impose an outcome on this situation, and in my view, an unrealistic outcome.
I think that there, just to be fair, I think that there may be some nefarious and less than honorable players involved in this that actually want this to continue to be a slow cooker kind of conflict for various interests. But I think that the vast majority is less nefarious, but not any less positive in terms of how it's result. And that is, we just have this mentality, and especially we have since Desert Storm, really, that we are the good guys, that we want to defend the outcast. We want to defend the little guy, and we want to bring democracy and peace to everywhere. So when the Democrats were in power, it was, it's kind of nation building. It was democracy building. And then when the Republicans are in power, all during this time, They just kind of have a different variant of it, but it's kind of the same things that we want to bring stability. And, you know, with our experience and our resources, we have a moral obligation, so goes the thought, to try to bring this in. And so the intentions are good. The problem is that it just can't be done because the cultural differences are so great that you can't impose a Western view on a Middle Eastern culture. It just doesn't work.
Well, I can believe that the troops on the ground in Syria have some good motives, but I don't think many people are buying the justification or the moral proclamations about our goals in Syria anymore. I really don't think that we're convincing many people of that nowadays.
Well, I think you're completely right, and that's one of the reasons why I think that. And you've seen some polls in the last 6 months or so, I think, bear up what you're saying, is that more and more people are saying, you know what, let's just get our troops out of there because they're not accomplishing anything. And I think that if we could ever get to the point to where, you know, a handful of really key and influential either members of Congress or certainly the administration ever said, you know what, we're going to actually do that. We're going to start moving up. That's why I was so encouraged last week when President Trump said that, because I thought, wow, here, finally, you know, the president is saying this, and I bet the people will support this really, you know, in strong ways. And then, you know, we had this alleged chemical strike in between, and everything's been turned upside down since then.
I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from your article.
Sure.
This is a quote from Col Davis. However much any official may desire the accomplishment of these two goals, the goals being to ensure that militants do not regain territory and to keep Iranian involvement at bay. Based on my 4 combat deployments in the region, I can confirm that they are utterly unattainable militarily. More important, even if it were militarily attainable, we should still avoid another open-ended military commitment disconnected from U.S. security. And then, quote, Washington expended precious resources that could have otherwise been spent on improved readiness, modernization, and other high-valued purposes. Aside from the fact that it is militarily impossible to accomplish the laundry list of goals in Syria, countering Iran, which can't even be defined, opposing Assad, which isn't necessary for U.S. security, and stopping Turkey from attacking Syrian Kurds, risking confrontation with our NATO ally, it is not in America's interest to stay in Syria for objectives so disconnected from our security and prosperity. Contrary to conventional wisdom in Washington, the strategic benefit doesn't come anywhere close to justifying the cost. American security is neither enhanced nor placed at increased risk, regardless of how the Syrian war is eventually resolved. Our government's obligation to defend U.S. interests and citizens remains the same either way, and we will continue to successfully protect our vital national interests. So the 2 things that stood out to me in this one, in these paragraphs, were the opportunity cost, what we could be doing. I've heard numerous officers talk about the readiness issue, the exhaustion issue, the too far spread issue of the military, and I personally think that's really important. And why are they not being listened to? Why?
Yeah. It really is that strong. You know, when I hear so many, especially members of Congress, I'm not going to name names at the moment, who get large campaign contributions from the defense industry, you know, constantly rail about this. Our military is not, you know, we've lost readiness because of sequestration, because we don't have enough money, which is absurd, and it's patently untrue just on the surface of it, because our military budget is extraordinary. It's huge for the situation that we find ourselves into today. And I don't hear any of those people saying what should be the obvious that all of these military members you just cited do. And it's like, if there's a readiness crisis, to the extent one does exist, and it does, it's because we spread ourselves to the 4 winds and we do all these little things that that take away from our opportunity to train for the conventional fights that we may one day have to fight. I'm not at all saying that we should do this, but it certainly is a possibility that we may one day have to fight a conventional fight against North Korea. We might have to fight against China, against Russia, against Iran. I don't think we should do any of them, but it's at least theoretically possible. And right now, the conventional military capability, the speed and the capability with which we have our forces right now is definitely, without any question, it is substantially lower than it was prior to 2003 invasion of Iraq. And if you want to actually do something that's going to increase our readiness, then we need to be training on the conventional kinds of things that actually could pose an existential threat to the United States, as opposed to all these which don't even have a security threat. And that really, really does need to change.
In my view, it's money better spent, too. I don't like the fact that we're pouring so much money into this, but if we're going to, could we at least do it in a way that really does keep our interests? I don't know how to say it. But when we talk,
here's a perfect example of what you just said there. I mean, if we shut down the mission in Afghanistan because it falls in the same category that what I just talked here, it's just on a slightly larger scale. But my goodness gracious, we are spending $45 billion a year on a mission that has nothing to do with American national security anymore. And just imagine if we just didn't spend that $45 billion and we didn't have all those troops that are over there constantly rotating in and out, preparing and coming back from rotations over there, and instead we're focusing on training the force. Well, you could literally not increase the budget by a penny. You could cut it by $45 billion. It would have no negative impact at all on the whole bulk of the force. Or you could just borrow less money. We could spend that money on infrastructure, for example. I mean, all these kinds of things that are possible, but the increase to the capability and the readiness of the United States Army, our military, would be substantially increased. Our security would be increased just by stopping doing these things that don't help us.
You know what else would be increased? I think, and I have a little bit of anecdotal experience, but recruiting would improve. Because, I've got sons who are military age. And one of them was interested in going to one of the academies initially. Another one could probably benefit from a couple of years in the service, But, we're afraid they're just going to deploy them right to Afghanistan. And for what?
Right.
And I don't think that I'm alone in feeling this way.
You are not, because I've got a 15-year-old who very soon will be of that age, and I'm already am concerned about that. And I put myself in the shoes of a lot of these family members that I see, like that that soldier that was killed 2 weeks ago in Syria. I thought, man, how would I feel if my son sacrificed his life wearing our uniform, doing something that had nothing to do with our security? I would be just livid, and I don't want to find out what that's like.
Yeah,
and I don't want anyone to find out.
And confused, and conflicted, like the ways that would tear you apart. I can certainly imagine it. And I keep hearing U.S. interests and our vital national interests. And I thought I knew what that was. But I realized recently I really don't know what that is, because it doesn't seem to line up with the things that I think are in our national interests. And I think that, I don't know how to put it without sound, but I think it's corporate interests. It's the interests of various, Princeton University did a study and determined that we're not really even democracy anymore. We're an oligarchy because we have such wealth and power concentrated at the top, which creates oligarchs. Yeah, that sounds like a wacky name, but I think that's really what we have. And we also have as Scott Horton, who was where I became aware of you were in his book, and I heard interviews. He talks about the self-licking ice cream cone thing.
Right, right.
And just this whole thing about keeping these wars going because, it keeps the profits flowing. It keeps the jobs and all this stuff. And I don't see how we get out of this. It's a
great American. I love that man, and we need more just like him to beat these drums, to bring, and like what you're doing with this very program right here is to expose what's going on, so more and more people have an understanding, and that maybe if we get a critical mass of it, we can actually have some impact on the members of Congress to start doing some things that make sense for our country.
Yeah, exactly. And just to touch on real quick, I don't want to keep you too long, just to talk about that bit in Scott's book. The book is Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. There's a chapter about Colonel Davis, and it talks about the report that he wrote after he came back from Afghanistan, having traversed the whole country, speaking to hundreds of troops at all levels in the interest of figuring out ways to better equip them faster, what they needed and when they needed it. And, well, why don't you just, the conclusion of that, or the part that I found most interesting, was that the commanders in that case, I want to be careful how I put this, they were, as Scott puts it, they were conducting like an information warfare campaign on our Congress and our people to convince everybody that things were going well and should keep going well, and should, continue. We should continue to deploy troops there and to keep up a charade, because what they were telling us was not true. Things were not getting better. They were getting worse. And I do feel like that is happening again now in Syria. I feel like this whole issue of saying that we need to attack Syria and attack Russia because of alleged chemical weapons attacks, I'm just not buying it, Colonel Davis. I'm not buying it.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, because what specifically I observed that Scott was talking about in the book there was how David Petraeus was one of them. You had several other, even some senior civilian in the government at secretariat level would go before Congress and say, oh, yeah, we're making progress. We're on the right path. We're trending in the right direction. We've got the momentum on our side. All of these buzzwords. And they kept saying it's going better when nothing could be further from the truth. And we have now since seen that everything that I talked about there, that everything that I exposed from the ground was absolutely correct. And that's why it's in the horrible shape that it is today. And you're right. I do see some. I heard a couple of cabinet level members in the very recent past talk about how, oh, yes, we have to have more money because the defense of our country is so important, and we don't have enough money, which is not true for the reasons we mentioned, and that we cannot, is the phrase, we can't get these 2,000 troops out of Syria because the job's not finished yet. Well, okay, look, this is important. I don't think we've talked about this, and I want to make sure we get this in there at some point. 2,000 men on the ground in a country can do nothing. So them staying there does not prevent anything from happening. It doesn't prevent ISIS from rising again. It can't even stop them. All they can do is defend where they are. We can defend ourselves and maybe go on small little raids here and there, but nothing that will have any impact on anything. So all those guys do there is defend themselves and put their lives at risk every day. They do not help our country, and that's why it's time to pull them out. But it's important to understand that, because it's a myth completely that anything negative will happen if they come out, because they're not preventing anything right now.
And in fact, I've seen situations where it ended up being to ISIS's advantage. Most recently, the airstrikes that Israel did on the T4 air base in the eastern Homs region. I read later on that soon after those airstrikes, ISIS took advantage of that and made a move because they could, because those airstrikes happened. And that's not the first time that something like that has happened. The other time, I believe it was the major airstrike that basically scuttled a peace deal that Lavrov and Curry had made. And then there was an airstrike in Deir ez-Zor that killed about 100 Syrian troops. And immediately, ISIS moved on those besieged Syrian troops in Deir ez-Zor. So I can see how our position there, it actually works against our stated objective of eliminating ISIS from the region. So, it's even worse.
Yes. And so just yet another reason why it's time for us to move.
Yeah. And to define, how about if somebody defines what are these national interests that you're talking about? Because if you're telling the truth and that these things do support our interests, well then let's not make it vague. Let's make it very specific about what those interests are, because I'm not sure that I would agree with them. Anyway, so how about, is there a vibe? The Pentagon is a very large place. I don't know, it's not monolith, obviously, but do you get a sense of what the Pentagon thinks about this, our occupation in Syria, and about this potential confrontation with Russia?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that there's a considerable number of people, especially planners, who are fully aware of the risks that we're facing and how difficult it would be on us if we actually had to engage in this, especially if anything went south or if Russia, took more of an aggressive response than what some would hope that they would do. But the problem is, you've got the senior leaders who, many of whom are just going to do, they're going to do what they're told, and they may even give reports to confirm, some of the civilian leaders that say, what you want to do, sure, we can do that, because part of it is not nefarious. Part of it's just in our DNA. Right. You give me a mission, I'm going to do it. Even if I think it's crazy, even if I think it's impossible, dadgummit, we're going to figure a way to make it happen, and so there's a lot of goodness in that, but there's also some harm in it that, sometimes the best thing you can do for national security and the service of our country is to say, no, sir, we cannot accomplish that at a cost that you can afford. And we won't be able to succeed because we'll end up, doing it halfway, or the casualties will be too high and the American people won't support, something like that. Sometimes somebody needs to stand up with some, like 3 or 4 stars on their shoulder and say, no, sir, we cannot do that. And I cannot in good conscience obey that order. So if you require me to do it, then I'm going to have to resign. I'd love to see somebody with the moral courage to do that.
And those 2,000 troops on the ground in Syria, I personally think there's a lot more, but certainly there's probably contractors and things like that, because there's somewhere between 13 and 20 bases. Some of them are tiny bases, but some of them are bigger. Some of them are air bases. So that means that presumably they're also spread out all over the place. Now, It's not like sitting out there, in a pup tent on their own in the middle of the desert. They're training and advising, and they're embedded in the SDF. But still, what are you going to do if you're Iran, Syria, and Russia, and you've just been seriously attacked and your troops have been killed by America?
Exactly.
And there are American troops sitting right there, sitting ducks. How can they even protect themselves?
Yeah. We are so vulnerable to that. That's one of the impetus behind my saying that we need to get them out, because that's part of the strategic risk that I mentioned earlier, is that they're literally sitting ducks. I assure you that Russia has, 10-digit grids zeroed in on where most of those bases you just mentioned are. And if their government gives them the authority, or if they themselves lose any of their troops in, Air Force or aircraft or men on the ground, I think that the chances are probably better than we're comfortable with that they might pull the trigger on some of those targets.
Yeah, and it may not be today. It may not be tomorrow. But they have they're surrounded by hostile forces.
Right.
And there's going to be an opportunity to take them out. And I don't think it's fair in any sense of the word. All right. Well, I don't want to keep you too long, but
I'm sorry. I'm going to have to jump off here because I actually have another interview here in a few minutes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thanks for letting me be on your show. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it too. Take care.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. A special thank you to Col Davis. He's in high demand for interviews today, so I especially appreciate his taking the time to talk with me. Follow Col Davis on Twitter at Daniel L. Davis 1. Keep an eye out for his articles in various publications like The National Interest, where he contributes regularly. Also the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Guardian. And look for his media interviews on CNN, CNBC, Fox News, Fox Business. And share those articles and interviews with your family and friends. Follow us at Around the Empire. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast channels at iTunes, other podcast apps. We're independent media, so we rely on your contributions. This podcast is brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can help with that by going to patreon.com/aroundtheempire or by doing a one-time donation using the links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. And we'll see you next time. Take care.